In the frozen wilderness of Idaho, veteran Jimmy Riley thought he had found peace beside Phantom, the German shepherd he had saved from the brink of death. But that peace was just an illusion. One afternoon, while struggling with a stubborn log, Jimmy muttered a phrase in Russian, a piece of a military past he had tried to bury. He was not speaking to Phantom, but the dog reacted instantly. It sprang to its feet, into the rigid stance of a soldier, its amber eyes locked on Jimmy, awaiting the next command. An absolute obedience, impossible for a normal dog. Jimmy froze. He realized the creature he had taken in was not just a stray. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind howled like a hungry wolf outside, its voice a lonely and constant companion to the man inside the train car. Here, nestled deep in the rugged mountains of Idaho, winter did not visit. It laid siege. For Jimmy Echo Riley, the siege was a welcome one. It built the walls of his isolation higher, muffling the sounds of a world he no longer felt a part of. At 40 years old, Jimmy wore the geography of a hard life on his face. He was a tall man, lean, but with the dense, wiry strength of someone accustomed to hardship. His brown hair was cut short, a habit from a former life, and had surrendered to streaks of premature silver at the temples. His face, etched with lines of past sorrows, was rugged, but his gray eyes held a deep-seated kindness that had been buried, not extinguished. A thick layer of stubble covered his jaw, a testament to his disregard for vanities, like a daily shave. He sat in a worn armchair, staring into the rhythmic dance of flames inside a pot-bellied stove that pulsed with warmth, a defiant heart beating against the frozen wilderness. He wore his uniform of solitude, an old unzipped brown leather jacket over a plaid flannel shirt of faded navy, gray, and beige. His jeans were denim-worn pale with time, and his feet were clad in sturdy work boots that had paced more miles of lonely forest trails than city sidewalks. This train car, a rusted relic from a long-dead railroad line, was his fortress. It was where he wrestled with the ghosts that had followed him home from the sun-scorched earth of Afghanistan. A log inside the stove popped loudly, a sharp crack that echoed the sound of a distant rifle. Jimmy flinched, his body tensing involuntarily. The scent of burning pine vanished, replaced for a sickening moment by the acrid smell of dust and cordite. The howl of the wind became the shriek of incoming fire. The year was 2012. The heat was suffocating. He saw the face of Corporal Davis, barely 20 years old, grinning at him from across the IED crater. "All clear, Echo?" Davis had asked. Jimmy had swept the area twice. He had trusted his training, his instincts, his equipment. "All clear, Davis. You're good." The memory always ended there. It ended with the sound his training had taught him to identify in his sleep, the sound of a pressure plate giving way. It ended with the brilliant, terrible flash of light and the crushing weight of failure. He hadn't saved Davis. He, the expert, the one they called Echo, because he could hear the faintest whispers of danger, had failed to hear the one that mattered most. That failure was the ghost that sat with him in the silence, the true architect of his isolation. He shook his head, the motion sharp and violent, chasing the vision away. The train car returned. The warmth, the smell of pine, the relentless wind. He was safe. But he was alone. His guilt was a wall as real as the steel around him. He thought of his brother, Mark. A successful tech executive in Boise, Mark saw Jimmy's life as a surrender, a waste. Their last phone call, months ago, had been strained. Mark's world was one of logic, ambition, and forward momentum. He couldn't comprehend Jimmy's stillness, this self-imposed exile driven by a wound no one could see. The storm outside intensified, throwing handfuls of snow against the windows like gravel. Then, through the symphony of the blizzard, a new sound pricked at the edges of his hearing. It was a thin, desperate cry, almost stolen by the wind the moment it was uttered. Jimmy froze, head cocked, listening. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on him, twisting through the skeleton of a dead tree. He tried to dismiss it, to sink back into the familiar comfort of his solitude. But he heard it again, a high, pained whine. It was not the sound of the wind. It was the sound of a living thing in agony. The part of him that was a soldier, the part that was trained to respond to distress, stirred from its long slumber. He could not ignore it. He could not sit by the fire while something else suffered and died in the cold. It was an instinct, a desperate need to succeed at saving a life where he had once so catastrophically failed. With a deep sigh, he rose from the chair. He pulled on a heavy winter parka, wrapped a wool scarf around his neck and face, and tugged a beanie down to his ears. Grabbing a powerful flashlight and a length of rope, he braced himself and pushed open the heavy door. The world that greeted him was a maelstrom of white fury. The wind tore at him, stinging his exposed skin with ice crystals. Snow, already knee-deep, made every step a monumental effort. Visibility was a few feet at best. He followed the direction of the sound, a ghost of a cry that he could feel more than hear. He moved with the methodical patience of a man trained to navigate hostile environments, his light cutting a pale, wavering beam through the swirling chaos. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Doubt began to creep in. He was chasing a phantom, a trick of the wind and his own haunted mind. He was about to turn back when his light snagged on something. A dark shape, a mound against the pure white, huddled at the base of a snow-laden pine. He trudged closer, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a dog, a large German shepherd, its beautiful coat of gray and white matted with snow and ice. The animal was curled into a tight ball, shivering violently, a dark patch of crimson staining the snow beneath its flank. It was alive, but barely. Its breathing was shallow, each exhale a small, pained cloud in the frigid air. Jimmy knelt, his own cold forgotten. "Hey there, fella," he whispered, his voice rough. The dog's head lifted weakly, its eyes, intelligent and amber-colored, fixed on him. There was no fear in them, no aggression, only a deep, weary pain and a flicker of awareness. Jimmy's gaze fell to the dog's neck. Around it was not a typical collar with a name tag, but a thick, worn leather band. Affixed to it was a metal plate, not plastic, etched with a complex series of letters and numbers, a military-style code that spoke of purpose and design. He knew in that moment he could not leave it. This was not a choice. It was a duty. Gently, he unzipped his parka, wrapping the heavy garment around the dog's trembling body. With a grunt of effort, he carefully lifted the animal into his arms. The dog was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, but Jimmy held on, his own aches and pains secondary. The journey back was a brutal, slow-motion battle against the storm. But with every step, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He wasn't just retreating from the world. He was carrying something precious out of the storm and into safety. Back inside the train car, the warmth was a blissful shock. He laid the dog gently on a thick wool blanket in front of the stove. The animal whined softly as Jimmy began his work. He cleaned the wound on its flank, a deep gash possibly from an animal trap or a sharp piece of metal, with antiseptic from his first aid kit. The dog never struggled, only watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. As the hours passed, the dog's shivering subsided. Jimmy sat with it, periodically checking its breathing and offering it small sips of water. He gave it a name, a word that came to him as he watched the silent, stoic animal. Phantom. Later that night, exhausted, Jimmy drifted into a fitful sleep in his armchair. The nightmares came as they always did. The dust, the shouting, the face of Davis looking at him with trust just before the world exploded. He cried out in his sleep, his body jerking. He was woken by a gentle, wet nudge against his hand. He opened his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. Phantom had dragged himself from the blanket and laid his head on the arm of the chair, his amber eyes fixed on Jimmy's. The dog whined again, a low, soft sound of comfort. Jimmy stared at the dog, his breathing slowly returning to normal. The ghost of Davis began to recede, replaced by the solid, living presence beside him. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on Phantom's head. The dog leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small, warm space of the train car, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Jimmy wasn't entirely alone with his ghosts. He had an anchor, a quiet guardian who had appeared from the heart of the storm. The responsibility felt heavy, but for the first time, it was a weight that did not threaten to crush him. It was a weight that might just save him. A week passed. The great blizzard retreated into the mountains, leaving behind a world sculpted in silent, brilliant white. The sun, a rare visitor, cast long blue shadows across the snow, and the immediate, life-or-death crisis of survival gave way to a quiet, shared routine. Phantom's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. The deep gash in his flank, cleaned and stitched by Jimmy's methodical hands, was already healing cleanly. The dog's constitution was as strong as his disciplined demeanor. He was a shadow at Jimmy's side, moving with a silent grace that was uncanny for an animal of his size. His gray and white coat seemed to let him merge with the snowy landscape, making his name feel all the more fitting. His amber eyes missed nothing. They followed the flight of a distant eagle, the twitch of a squirrel's tail, and most of all, they followed Jimmy. It was a watchful, steady presence, a silent communication that Jimmy found himself coming to rely on. The crushing weight of absolute solitude had lifted, replaced by a shared quiet. Jimmy found himself talking to the dog, filling the silence with observations about the weather or memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Phantom would listen, his head cocked, his gaze unwavering. For the first time since he had returned from Afghanistan in 2013, Jimmy was using his voice for something other than the barest of necessities. He was sharing his space, his thoughts, his life. It was a strange and fragile feeling. One afternoon, Jimmy was trying to split a particularly stubborn log of pine wood. The axe bounced off a knot for the third time, the impact jarring his arms. A wave of frustration, sharp and hot, surged through him. Without thinking, a phrase from his past slipped out, a relic from a joint training exercise with Russian Spetsnaz liaisons years ago. "Stoy it," he growled at the log, the Russian word for stand or stay, a low curse on his lips. Instantly, Phantom, who had been dozing near the warmth of the train car's wall, went rigid. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion and stood at perfect attention, his body tense, his eyes locked on Jimmy, waiting for the next command. Jimmy stared, the axe forgotten in his hand. His frustration evaporated, replaced by a cold shock of disbelief. He had not been speaking to the dog. It was a random, angry utterance. He took a slow breath, his mind racing. He remembered the grueling 2-week program in the mid-2000s, learning basic phrases to coordinate with the stoic Russian soldiers. He had compartmentalized those memories along with everything else from that life. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the axe. He looked directly at Phantom. Keeping his voice low and even, he gave another command he hadn't thought of in over a decade. "Ryadam." "Beside me." Phantom moved without hesitation. He trotted to Jimmy's left side, sat perfectly straight, and looked up, his tail giving a single, controlled thump against the snow. He was in the classic heel position. A shiver traced its way down Jimmy's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This was not a trick. This was not a coincidence. This was ingrained high-level training, the kind of training reserved for elite special operations canine units. And it was in Russian. For a moment, Jimmy felt a flicker of his old self, the analyst, the soldier who pieced together fragments of intelligence to see the bigger picture. It was the first time since his return that a skill from his past had surfaced, not as a source of trauma, but as a key to a puzzle. It was a strange, disarming sensation, like finding a piece of himself he thought was long dead. A few days later, the warming sun and melting snow began to reveal the damage the blizzard had wrought. On the steep slope behind the train car, a section of earth heavy with melted snow had given way. It wasn't a major event, just a muddy slide of rock and soil that had torn away a patch of the forest floor, leaving a raw, brown scar against the white. Jimmy was walking the perimeter of his small clearing, Phantom trotting easily beside him, no longer favoring his injured leg. Suddenly, the dog stopped. His nose went to the ground, sniffing intently at the air near the landslide. A low whine rumbled in his chest. He left Jimmy's side and bounded towards the slide, his focus absolute. "Phantom, what is it?" Jimmy called. The dog ignored him. He began digging frantically at the base of the slide, sending clumps of mud and snow flying. His excitement was palpable, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. Intrigued, Jimmy made his way over. In the churned-up earth where Phantom was digging, something glinted. Jimmy knelt and brushed away the loose dirt. His fingers closed around a cold, hard object. He pulled it free. It was a metal cylinder about the length of his hand, made of a dull, heavy alloy that hadn't corroded despite clearly having been buried for a long time. It was sealed tight, a marvel of old-world craftsmanship. This was no random piece of junk. It had been placed here, deliberately. The landslide was a stroke of luck. Phantom's nose was pure skill. He carried it back to the train car, the dog trotting proudly beside him. After a few minutes of careful work with a wrench, the threaded cap of the cylinder groaned and came loose. Inside, nestled in what looked like oilcloth, were two items. The first was a heavy, old-fashioned skeleton key, its design intricate. The second was a thin sheet of metal, perhaps aluminum or titanium, with a map etched into its surface. It was not a printed map, but a series of topographical lines and symbols carved with precision. Jimmy recognized the general layout of the mountains around him, but the destination marked with a precise X was in a region he knew to be remote, wild, and officially uninhabited. The final piece of the day's puzzle arrived just before dusk. Jimmy was outside, securing a loose panel on the train car's roof, when he heard it. A faint, high-pitched hum, completely alien to the natural sounds of the wilderness. It was the sound of modern technology, and it was getting closer. Phantom heard it too. He stood in the middle of the clearing, a low growl vibrating in his chest, his head tilted back as his eyes scanned the darkening sky. Jimmy followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Then, against the deep purple of the twilight sky, he spotted it. A black multi-rotor drone, sleek and silent, moving with methodical purpose. It was not a hobbyist's toy. It had the design and flight characteristics of a military or corporate surveillance unit. It was flying a grid pattern, its optical sensor a single unblinking eye sweeping over the forest below. His blood ran cold. The training, the instincts he had tried so hard to bury, took over. He grabbed Phantom's collar and pulled him into the deep shadows of the pines bordering the clearing. They were being hunted. The drone made another pass, its hum the only sound in the frozen air. It was systematic, professional. It was not looking for a lost hiker. It was looking for an asset. And as Jimmy knelt there in the snow, his hand resting on the powerfully built dog at his side, the pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The advanced training, the coded military tag, the buried cache. And now, this. The drone was not searching for him. It was searching for Phantom. It could only mean one thing. The dog had a tracker, a small subcutaneous implant, standard procedure for a high-value asset. His quiet, isolated world had not just been breached. It had been an illusion all along. The storm had brought him a companion, but it had also brought a war to his doorstep. His sanctuary was no longer safe. His solitude was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of an approaching threat. The illusion of peace shattered. The drone's mechanical hum was a declaration of war, and Jimmy's sanctuary had become a compromised position. There was no discussion, no hesitation. The soldier in him, long dormant, took command. Survival depended on movement. "Time to go, Phantom," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. The dog was already on its feet, alert and focused, as if he had been waiting for the order. Within 10 minutes, Jimmy had a pack ready. He moved with an economy of motion that was ingrained in his very bones. A small supply of dried rations, a water filter, his first aid kit, a compass, and the heavy metal cylinder containing the key and the map. He slung a rifle over his shoulder, a tool he had hoped to only ever use for hunting, but which now felt like a necessary extension of his arm. He took one last look around the train car, the small, quiet world he had built against the ghosts of his past. Now the ghosts were outside, and they had sent a machine to find him. They left under the cover of the dense pine forest, moving away from the clearing. Phantom took the lead, not with the happy energy of a normal dog, but with the quiet purpose of a scout navigating hostile territory. He moved from shadow to shadow, pausing to listen, his nose testing the wind. Jimmy followed, his own senses on high alert, his steps silent on the carpet of pine needles. He was no longer a recluse, he was an operator on the move. The map etched on the metal plate was their guide. It was a difficult journey, leading them away from marked trails and deep into the rugged, untamed heart of the Idaho mountains. For 2 days they traveled, climbing steep, rocky inclines and navigating dense, snow-choked valleys. Jimmy's body, though hardened by a life outdoors, ached with the effort. But his mind was sharp, clear in a way it had not been for years. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety had been replaced by the clean focus of a mission. On the 3rd day, the map led them to a sheer rock face, a dead end of granite and ice. Jimmy checked the map again, then the compass. There was no mistake. This was the spot marked with an X. "Now what, boy?" he murmured. Phantom did not seem confused. He trotted directly to a specific section of the rock wall, a spot partially hidden by a cluster of ancient, gnarled junipers. He sniffed at a narrow fissure, then looked back at Jimmy and gave a single, soft bark. Jimmy approached, his hand running over the cold stone. The fissure was barely wide enough for his hand. He felt inside, his fingers searching. They brushed against something that was not rock. It was a small, recessed metal plate with a keyhole in its center. It was almost invisible, a masterful piece of camouflage. With a deep breath, he took the old, heavy key from his pack. He slid it into the lock. For a moment, he expected resistance, the grinding of metal seized by decades of rust and ice. Instead, it turned with a smooth, satisfying click. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, a low hum vibrated through the rock beneath his feet. With a deep groan of grinding stone, the section of the rock face Phantom had indicated receded inwards, revealing a dark, square opening. It was a door, a seamless piece of engineering designed to blend perfectly with the mountain itself. A wave of cool, dry air washed over them, carrying a faint scent of ozone and dormant machinery. Lights flickered on deep inside the corridor, one after another, as if the mountain itself was slowly waking up. The systems were in hibernation, powered by a source that had defied the passage of time. Geothermal energy, he guessed. The only thing that made sense this far from any grid. Phantom entered without hesitation, a soldier returning to his post. Jimmy followed, the massive stone door hissing shut behind them, sealing them inside a world cut off from time. The corridor was long and sterile, the air clean and still. They passed heavy steel doors, each marked with coded symbols. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft padding of Phantom's paws on the concrete floor. Finally, they reached a larger chamber, a central control room. Banks of outdated but immaculate computer terminals stood silent. A large map of the world, dotted with strategic markers from the Cold War era, covered one wall. And standing by the central console was a woman. She turned as they entered, her movements fluid and deliberate. She was old, perhaps in her late 70s or early 80s, with a crown of stark white hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were a startlingly clear, intelligent blue. They held the weight of immense knowledge and a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was dressed not in a lab coat, but in a simple, functional gray jumpsuit. There was a strength in her posture, a resilience that had outlasted the era that built this place. This was a guardian, not a prisoner. Her gaze went first to Phantom. A wave of raw emotion passed over her face, relief so potent it was almost painful. Delta, she whispered, the name a soft exhale. Phantom trotted to her, nuzzling her hand. There was no doubt. He knew her. Then her eyes settled on Jimmy. The relief in her expression was joined by a deep, familiar sorrow. "You have your father's eyes," she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the silent room. "I am Dr. Maria." Jimmy stood speechless, his mind trying to process the impossible reality before him. "My father? General Riley?" "Yes," Dr. Maria confirmed. "He was a good man, Jimmy. A better man than his duty sometimes allowed him to be. He spoke of you and your brother often. He worried that his world would cast too long a shadow over yours." She offered a small, sad smile. It seems he was right. The mention of his father, spoken with such familiar warmth in this impossible place, disarmed him completely. He had always seen his father as a stern, distant figure, a man defined by his rank and his unyielding principles. Dr. Maria gestured to a chair. "Please, you have questions, and I have been silent for a very long time." For the next hour she spoke, and the incredible, secret history of the last 40 years unfolded. She told him of Project Chimera, born in the paranoia of the Cold War in the late 1970s. It was not a program to build weapons, she explained, but to create guardians. They had used the era's nascent genetic engineering to enhance the intelligence and physical capabilities of German Shepherds, creating canine assets capable of complex problem-solving and unwavering loyalty. Phantom, or Subject Delta as we knew him, was our greatest success, she said, her hand resting on the dog's head. His intelligence borders on the intuitive. He understands intent, not just commands. She explained how the project was officially shut down in the early 1990s, deemed too controversial. But it was never truly dismantled. It was hidden, preserved by a small, secret group of patriots, including his father. "Then why is he out there? Why was he hurt?" Jimmy asked, the question that had burned in his mind since he first saw the drone. Dr. Maria's expression darkened. "We were compromised. A few weeks ago, during a transport to a secondary facility, we were ambushed. Phantom's handler, a good man, was killed. Phantom escaped in the chaos, wounded. They have been hunting him ever since." "They? The drone?" "A corporation called Omnicorp, the public face of a shadow group called the Zenith Syndicate," she said. "They have been trying to acquire our research for years. They want to weaponize it." Finally, she stood and led him to a heavy door at the back of the chamber. She pressed her hand to a panel, and the door hissed open, revealing a small, cryogenically cooled room. Inside, row upon row of small, frozen vials were stored in liquid nitrogen tanks. "This is the heart of the project," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The legacy, a gene bank holding the DNA of our best subjects. The source code for animals like Phantom. It was your father's ultimate failsafe. He believed that if the world was going to have guardians, they should be born of loyalty and instinct, not greed and power." Jimmy stared at the vials, the cold vapor swirling around his feet. He finally understood. This was not just about a dog, it was about a legacy, an inheritance of responsibility passed down to him by a father he was only now beginning to know. And at the center of it all was the quiet, gray and white dog at his side, a living, breathing piece of that impossible history. The weight of Dr. Maria's revelation settled over Jimmy, heavy and suffocating as a burial shroud. He stared at the rows of frozen vials in the gene bank, each one a silent testament to a secret history that was now his own. His father had not just been a soldier, he had been a guardian of something beyond comprehension. And his brother, Mark, was on the other side. "He doesn't know," Dr. Maria said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She had led him back to the control room, the cold of the gene bank still clinging to him. "Mark is ambitious, and Omnicorp is the public face of the Zenith Syndicate. They would use his ambition, give him a high-level project, and call it asset acquisition. They would never tell him he was hunting for a living creature, let alone the legacy of his own father. She walked to a locked steel cabinet and opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. From inside, she withdrew a single sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. On the front, written in his father's sharp, familiar script, was his name, Jimmy. "Your father left this with me nearly 20 years ago," Dr. Maria said softly. "He told me to give it to you if the day ever came when you found your way here." He always believed that day would come. Jimmy took the letter with a hand that was not entirely steady. He ran his thumb over the brittle wax seal. For a moment, he was a boy again, standing in his father's immaculate study, the air thick with the scent of leather and discipline. General Riley had been a man of straight lines, direct orders, and a love that was more often felt in his expectations than in his words. He broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter began without sentiment. "Jimmy, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and the best has happened. The worst, because Chimera is threatened. The best, because you are the one who has answered the call. I am sorry for the secrets. I am sorry for the burden I am about to place on you. My duty bound me to silence, and it is my deepest regret that this duty created a distance between us." Jimmy's eyes blurred. The words were his father's voice, stripped of rank, speaking directly to him. "The work we did here is important. It is a terrible and beautiful power that must be protected from men who see only profit and control. I have watched you your entire life. I saw your struggles, your pain, after you came home from your service in 2013. I know you feel broken. But I never saw a broken man. I saw a man whose character was forged in loyalty and fire. You have a moral compass that a boardroom cannot comprehend. That is why I always believed that if a guardian was needed, it would be you. Your brother chose a different path. He sought to build a world of order and success, a way to escape the shadow of my uniform. I am proud of him, but his world is not equipped for this truth. Be careful, but do not give up on him. The blood you share is stronger than any corporate loyalty. The choice is yours. You can walk away, and no one would blame you. Or you can accept the duty that has found you. You can become the guardian I always knew you could be. Whatever you choose, know that I have always been proud to be your father." Jimmy folded the letter, the paper crinkling in his tight grip. The cold, empty space inside him, the one carved out by guilt and loneliness, was now filled with a burning sense of purpose. He was not a broken echo of his former self. He was his father's son. "I have to go to Boise," he said, his voice firm. Dr. Maria nodded, understanding. "There is a service tunnel that leads to the surface, a few miles from here. We kept a vehicle there for emergencies, a four-wheel drive truck from 1985. It is old, but it is reliable. Phantom knows the way." The journey from the timeless silence of the mountain to the bustling, orderly streets of Boise was a jarring transition. Phantom sat in the passenger seat of the old truck, a stoic, silent passenger, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. For Jimmy, it felt like traveling between two different realities. He was leaving the wilderness, his refuge of anonymity, and driving directly into the heart of the world he had fled. A world of schedules, spreadsheets, and gleaming glass towers. His brother's world. Omnicorp headquarters was one such tower, a monument of steel and dark glass that pierced the Idaho sky. Jimmy, dressed in his worn flannel and faded jeans, was a relic from another time as he walked into the pristine, minimalist lobby. After a tense conversation with a security guard who eyed him with suspicion and a phone call that Mark clearly did not want to receive, he was given a visitor's pass. The elevator ascended silently, lifting him into the stratosphere of corporate power. Mark's office was on the top floor. It was less an office and more a glass-walled kingdom, with a panoramic view of the entire city. And there, standing behind a vast desk of polished black stone, was Mark Riley. He was the perfect image of success, the man Jimmy could never be. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his face clean-shaven, his suit a tailored masterpiece of charcoal gray. He looked younger than Jimmy, though they were only 2 years apart, his face unlined by the harsh sun of Afghanistan or the sleepless nights that followed. His demeanor was one of impatient, controlled energy. "Jimmy," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "What is this? You can't just show up here." "I need to talk to you, Mark. It's important," Jimmy said, feeling the sterile air of the office suffocate his words. Phantom was not with him. He had left the dog hidden in the truck, knowing he would not be allowed inside. "Is everything okay? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Mark asked, his mind immediately going to the most logical and most damning conclusions. Debt? Another problem, another mess for him to fix. "No, it's about Dad. It's about your company, Omnicorp." Jimmy tried to explain. He spoke of a secret project, of a dog with impossible abilities, of a hidden base in the mountains. The words, which had been so real and so urgent in the silent control room with Dr. Maria, sounded like the ravings of a madman here, under the fluorescent lights and the judging eyes of his successful brother. Mark listened, his expression shifting from impatience to a deep, weary concern. He was not hearing a warning. He was hearing a diagnosis. "Jimmy, listen to me," Mark said, his voice softening into the tone one uses with a sick child. "You have been through a lot. What happened over there, it changes a person. Have you been talking to your therapist? Maybe we can find you a better program." "This is not my PTSD, Mark," Jimmy insisted, his voice rising. "This is real. They are hunting this dog. Dad was part of it. He left me a letter." "A letter? Jimmy, Dad's been gone for years," Mark said, shaking his head. "He would be so disappointed to see you like this, chasing conspiracy theories in the woods." The word struck Jimmy like a physical blow. Disappointed. It was the one weapon his brother had that could always find its mark. "You are a director at Omnicorp," Jimmy pressed, his voice strained. "A project, asset acquisition. Does that mean anything to you? An old military project from the 1980s? For a fleeting second, a flicker of something, recognition, confusion, crossed Mark's face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, buried under a lifetime of pragmatism. To even consider Jimmy's story was to invite chaos into his perfectly ordered life. To accept it meant his success, his career, this very office, might be built upon something monstrous. It was an existential threat, and Mark's defenses were absolute. "I think you should leave," Mark said, his voice cold and final. He pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Helen, could you please escort my brother out?" Jimmy stared at his brother, the man who shared his blood, but not his reality. He saw not a villain, but a man so terrified of losing the world he had built that he would blind himself to the truth. He had failed. He turned and walked out, leaving his brother standing alone in his glass castle, a king who refused to believe the dragon at his gate was real. Defeat was a bitter, familiar taste in Jimmy's mouth. He walked out of the gleaming elevator and into the cool, cavernous silence of the Omnicorp parking garage. The air smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes. Each step echoed, a lonely sound in the vast, empty space. He had played his only card and lost. Mark had not just dismissed him, he had looked at him with a pity that was worse than anger. Upstairs, in his glass-walled office, Mark Riley sank into his leather chair, the controlled confidence he projected now frayed at the edges. His brother's wild story circled in his mind, nonsensical and yet strangely persistent. Project Chimera. Dad was part of it. It was absurd. It was the rambling of a man whose mind had been broken by war. And yet, the name of the project tickled at his memory. On a whim, driven by a need to prove the absurdity to himself, he typed Project Chimera into his secure corporate search engine. The result was a single, heavily redacted file. An asset acquisition report from a subsidiary company, Omnicorp, had purchased 3 years prior. The project was from the 1980s, listed as defunct biological technology. Most of the text was blacked out, but one phrase caught his eye. Subject Delta, Asset Recovery Protocols, high priority. A cold knot formed in his stomach. It wasn't proof, but it was a disturbing echo of his brother's desperate words. He stood up, a sudden urgent need to talk to Jimmy again, to understand. Down in the garage, Jimmy's military instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, were screaming. The silence was wrong. It was too heavy, too watchful. He scanned the rows of cars, the deep shadows between concrete pillars. He saw nothing, but he felt it. Eyes on him. He quickened his pace toward the old truck, his hand hovering near the grip of the pistol tucked under his jacket. He was halfway there when they moved. Two men appearing from the shadows as if born from them. They wore dark, practical clothing, not uniforms, but they moved with a synchronized, fluid grace that was unmistakably professional. They did not rush him. They spread out, cutting off his path to the exit, their intent clear, to corner him, to take him. Jimmy reacted instantly, his body moving before his mind had time to process. He dove behind a large SUV, the hard concrete scraping his hands. He drew his weapon, his world shrinking to the immediate, visceral reality of the threat. It was in that moment that Mark stepped out of the elevator. He saw it all in a horrifying tableau. His brother, crouched behind a car with a gun in his hand, and two men advancing on him with a cold, predatory focus. The theoretical, dismissible fantasy from his office had just become brutally, terrifyingly real. His perfectly structured world, built on logic and control, shattered into a million pieces. These were not government agents. They were hunters, and his brother was the prey. He was a pawn, a well-paid, high-ranking, utterly disposable pawn in a game run by Abraham Goodman. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He was frozen, a statue of horrified disbelief. The first operative reached the SUV, his hand darting out to grab Jimmy. Suddenly, the back window of Jimmy's old truck exploded outwards in a shower of tempered glass. A gray and white blur launched from the truck bed, a silent, furry missile of contained fury. Phantom hit the first man with the force of a freight train, his 90 pounds of muscle and bone slamming into the operative's chest and driving him to the ground. There was no wild barking, no frantic snapping. It was a precise, tactical takedown. Before the man could react, Phantom's powerful jaws closed on the arm holding a taser, his growl a low, terrifying vibration. The second operative, momentarily stunned, turned his attention to the dog. It was the opening Jimmy needed. He moved from behind the car, not as a broken man, but as the soldier he had always been. His movements were efficient, his focus absolute. He closed the distance and disabled the second man with a series of quick, precise strikes to his wrist and knee, sending the man's weapon skittering across the floor. Mark could only stare, his mind unable to reconcile the scene. This was not the lost, haunted brother he pitied. This was a warrior, calm and lethal in the face of danger. And the dog was not a pet. It was a weapon. "Mark, get down!" Jimmy's voice was a sharp, clear command that cut through his shock. "Behind that pillar! Now!" For the first time since they were children, Mark did exactly as his younger brother told him. He scrambled behind the thick concrete pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs. The roles had been completely and irrevocably reversed. He, the successful executive, was a terrified civilian. Jimmy, the man he had called a failure, was now his only shield against this nightmare. With the immediate threats neutralized, Jimmy grabbed his brother's arm. "We have to go. Now." He pulled Mark toward the truck. Phantom, his duty done, released the first operative and leapt back into the truck bed, his eyes still scanning the shadows for more threats. Jimmy shoved Mark into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The old engine roared to life with a turn of the key. He slammed the truck into reverse, tires screeching as they sped out of the parking space and towards the exit. They drove through the streets of Boise, a city that now felt hostile and alien. The silence in the cab was thick with the adrenaline of the fight and the weight of everything that had just been shattered and remade. Mark stared out the window, his reflection a pale, shocked stranger. The clean lines of his world had been violently erased. Finally, as they cleared the city limits and headed back towards the dark, looming mountains, Mark spoke. His voice was a hoarse whisper, stripped of all its usual authority. "You were right," he said, not looking at his brother. "Everything you said. It was real. Jimmy, I am so sorry." The apology was not just for his disbelief in the office. It was for the years of condescension, of pity, of not understanding. It was the first crack in the wall he had built between them. Jimmy kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He gave a single, sharp nod. There would be time for words later. Now there was only survival. But for Mark, huddled in the passenger seat of his brother's battered truck, the flight from danger was something more. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey back, a journey of atonement and of finally learning what it meant to be a brother. The old truck barreled through the night, its headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The city of Boise was a fading glow in the rearview mirror, a discarded world of glass and steel. Inside the cab, the silence was a living thing, thick with the echoes of screeching tires and the ghost of their recent violent escape. Mark sat rigid in the passenger seat, his expensive suit now rumpled and stained, his face pale. He kept glancing at Jimmy, seeing not the broken recluse he had pitied, but a stranger, a focused, capable soldier who had moved through the chaos as if it were his natural element. Jimmy drove, his hands steady on the wheel. The adrenaline of the fight had receded, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. He used a disposable burner phone he'd kept for emergencies to contact Dr. Maria. His message, a short, coded burst of information. Her reply was equally brief, providing a new set of coordinates. "There's one last place," Jimmy said, breaking the silence. "An old mountain airfield, Dad's final contingency plan. That's where we need to go." Mark just nodded, his own world of corporate strategy and market projections seeming like a childish fantasy compared to this brutal reality of life and death. His journey of atonement had begun not with words but with a silent, humbling acceptance of his own ignorance. He watched his brother, and for the first time he saw the strength their father had always spoken of. They met Dr. Maria at dawn. The airfield was a desolate strip of cracked asphalt carved into a high mountain plateau, surrounded by a graveyard of rusted equipment and a single, dilapidated hangar. A rugged, twin-engine propeller plane sat waiting, a promise of escape in the cold morning air. Maria stood beside it, a small, resilient figure against the vast, empty landscape. The relief on her face when she saw them was immense. "I was so worried," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The comms went silent. "I feared the worst." "We ran into trouble," Jimmy said grimly. "They were waiting for us." "They are more resourceful than I imagined," Maria admitted. "But we are all here now. We must leave immediately. All the essential research and the gene bank samples are already loaded." For a fleeting moment, a sense of hope settled over them. They were so close. The open door of the plane was a gateway to a new life, to safety. Mark helped Maria with the last of the bags, while Jimmy and Phantom stood guard, scanning the perimeter. It was then that Jimmy realized their mistake. He had been so focused on the immediate threat, on his brother, that he had overlooked the obvious. How had the Zenith operatives in Boise known they were there? And if they knew that, what else did they know? His eyes fell on the metal cylinder he had pulled from the earth, the one that held the key and the map. The legacy of the head scientist. It was the one variable they had introduced into their world. "It's a trap," Jimmy breathed, his voice a harsh whisper. As if summoned by his words, the world erupted. Powerful floodlights blazed to life from the tree line, pinning them in a harsh artificial daylight. The roar of engines filled the air as a convoy of black SUVs emerged, blocking the end of the runway, their only escape route by land. And then came the sound that Jimmy had learned to dread above all others, the rhythmic, predatory thumping of helicopter blades, growing steadily louder. A searchlight from the sky lanced down, pinning their small plane like an insect under glass. "The journal," Maria gasped, her face ashen as she followed Jimmy's horrified gaze. "The container we found. It must have had a tracker in it, a micro-tracker. They weren't following Phantom. They were following their own lost property." It was a brilliant, ruthless move. Abraham Goodman's people had not been hunting them. They had been letting them lead the way to the final prize, Dr. Maria and the secrets she protected. The firefight was instant and brutal. Operatives began pouring from the SUVs, laying down a disciplined field of fire. "Mark, get Maria to the plane!" Jimmy yelled, the command snapping his brother out of his frozen shock. "Use that old fuel tanker for cover." The past fell away. There was no PTSD, no haunting flashbacks. The crack of gunfire was not a trigger for terror, but a call to action. The skills that had been the source of his deepest trauma now became his greatest shield. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, his mind a cold calculator of angles, trajectories, and tactical opportunities. He laid down suppressing fire, forcing the operatives to take cover, his shots precise and controlled. He saw not faces, only threats to be neutralized. This was not the chaotic violence of his nightmares. This was the brutal art of survival, and he was using it to protect what was left of his family. Each squeeze of the trigger, each tactical command he shouted, felt like a single step out of the darkness of his past. He was not a failure who had let a comrade die. He was a guardian, a protector. He was atoning. But they were hopelessly outgunned. The helicopter was the real threat. It hovered just beyond the hangar, its side door open, ready to deploy more troops and cut them off completely. The plane's pilot was shouting that he couldn't risk taking off with the chopper so close. They were pinned down, the promise of escape just yards away, but as unreachable as the moon. Phantom had been fighting at Jimmy's side, a gray and white shadow moving through the chaos, his presence a steadying force. But the dog, with his enhanced intelligence, understood the grim reality of their situation. He saw the stalemate. He saw the helicopter, the source of their doom. He stopped firing and looked at Jimmy. In the midst of the roaring engines and gunfire, a moment of perfect, profound silence passed between them. It was a look that transcended species, a shared understanding between two soldiers who knew the price of victory. It was a look of loyalty, of resolve, and of farewell. "No," Jimmy whispered, understanding what the dog was about to do. "Phantom, no, heel!" But it was not a command Phantom would obey. With one last hard push of his head against Jimmy's leg, he broke from cover. He did not charge the gunman. That would have been a pointless, sentimental gesture. His action was one of cold, tactical brilliance. He sprinted across the tarmac, a low, fast target, ignoring the bullets that kicked up puffs of asphalt around him. He ran directly towards the hovering helicopter. The gunner on board laughed, swinging his weapon to bear on the absurd target. But Phantom was faster than he could track. The dog launched himself into the air, a final, magnificent leap. He wasn't aiming for the men inside. He was aiming for the one vulnerable point he had identified with his superior intellect, the spinning, exposed tail rotor. There was a horrific, grinding shriek of metal on metal, and then a chaotic explosion of shrapnel. The helicopter, its balance instantly and catastrophically destroyed, began to spin wildly out of control. It lurched sideways, crashing into the hangar with a deafening roar, erupting into a massive fireball that lit up the dawn sky. "Phantom!" Jimmy's scream was a raw, ragged sound of pure agony, torn from the depths of his soul. The explosion threw the Zenith operatives into chaos. It was the opening they needed. "Jimmy, we have to go! Now!" Mark yelled, grabbing his brother, whose face was a mask of utter devastation. They dragged him towards the plane, his legs moving woodenly. He looked back at the fiery wreckage, at the spot where his friend, his comrade, his anchor to the world, had just ceased to exist. He had lost a part of his own soul. As the plane's engines screamed and they accelerated down the runway, lifting into the sky, Jimmy stared down at the chaos below. The battle was won. They were free. But the price of that freedom was a wound so deep He knew it would never truly heal. He had lost the loyal soldier who had pulled him out of the darkness, only to sacrifice himself to let him see the light. The world inside the small aircraft was a pocket of roaring silence. The drone of the twin engines was a constant, monotonous hum that did nothing to fill the vast, empty space that had opened up in Jimmy's soul. He sat by a small window, staring out at the jagged peaks of the Idaho mountains receding below, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He did not see the beauty of the landscape. He saw only the flash of a fiery explosion and the ghost of a gray and white dog. Dr. Maria sat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression a mixture of grief and profound exhaustion. Mark, however, was a man transformed. The shock and fear had been burned away in the firefight, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had opened an encrypted laptop and was working with a furious intensity, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was no longer a corporate executive. He was a combatant, using his own unique set of weapons. He was dismantling the digital life of Abraham Goodman, leaking the data they had secured to a trusted journalistic contact, and building a firewall of misinformation around their escape route. The news came in bursts over the next few days as they flew to a series of prearranged transfer points, moving like ghosts across the continent. Federal agents had raided the Omnicorp Tower in Boise. Abraham Goodman and his top lieutenants in the Zenith Syndicate had been arrested, charged with a litany of crimes from illegal weapons development to corporate espionage. But it was not a total victory. The larger entity of Omnicorp, with its army of lawyers and public relations experts, moved quickly. They condemned Goodman, branding him the leader of a rogue division, and severed all ties. The corporation survived, wounded but intact. The threat was not gone. It had simply receded into the shadows, forced to rebuild, to change its form. The world was safe for now, but the war for the future was not over. 6 months later. The air in the new facility was crisp, cool, and sterile, smelling faintly of clean metal and recycled air. It was located in a remote stretch of the Alaskan wilderness, disguised as an Arctic research station. It was a place of stark, beautiful desolation, a fitting home for a secret. Here, under the pale light of a low-hanging sun, a new kind of family had taken root. Mark stood in the central control room, not in a suit, but in a practical fleece jacket and cargo pants. He was monitoring global network traffic, his eyes scanning lines of code with the same intensity he once reserved for stock market tickers. He had applied his formidable corporate skills to a new, singular purpose: protecting Project Chimera. He managed their finances through a web of shell corporations, oversaw their supply lines, and waged a quiet digital war against anyone who might come looking for them. The brothers now worked together with an easy, unspoken understanding, their past conflicts burned away by shared trauma and a common mission. Jimmy walked into the room, and the change in him was even more profound. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady authority. He was still lean and hard, but he stood taller, his shoulders no longer stooped under an invisible weight. He had become the leader his father had always known he could be, overseeing the facility's security and tactical readiness. "Anything on the wire?" Jimmy asked, his voice calm. "The usual chatter. Omnicorp's new CEO is making a lot of noise about corporate responsibility," Mark said with a wry smile. "They are trying to bury Goodman so deep he will never be found. But I have an alert set for any mention of the subsidiary that acquired Chimera's assets. So far, it is quiet." "Good. Let us keep it that way," Jimmy said. He looked out the reinforced window at the vast, empty expanse of snow and ice. "It is time." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "He has been waiting for you." Jimmy left the control room and walked down a quiet, white corridor. He passed the laboratory where Dr. Maria was working, her quiet dedication a constant guiding presence. He passed the small, cryogenically preserved gene bank, the silent heart of their entire legacy. His destination was a large, climate-controlled habitat at the far end of the facility, designed for training and exercise. He opened the door and was immediately greeted by a tiny, clumsy avalanche of paws and happy yelps. A German Shepherd puppy, no more than 12 weeks old, bounded towards him. Its coat was a familiar, heart-stopping pattern of gray and white, its ears comically large for its head, and its eyes held a spark of brilliant, curious intelligence. He was a perfect miniature echo of the friend Jimmy had lost. "Hello, Spectre," Jimmy said, his voice soft as he knelt on the floor. The puppy, whose name was Spectre, launched himself into Jimmy's arms, licking his face with unrestrained puppy enthusiasm. Jimmy held him close, burying his face in the soft fur. For a moment, the grief, which had settled into a dull, constant ache in his chest, became sharp again. It was a pain he had learned to live with, a scar he would carry forever. But it was no longer a wound that crippled him. He set the puppy down and took a small training toy from his pocket. Spectre immediately focused on it, his body quivering with anticipation. "Ready to work?" Jimmy asked. He held the toy up, and in a quiet, clear voice, he gave the first command. "Kommen." Come to me. The puppy, with an instinct that defied his young age, responded instantly. He moved to Jimmy's side, sat and looked up, his gaze locked on his new master, waiting. Jimmy looked at this small, living spark of hope, and he thought of Phantom. He did not think of the fire and the terrible sacrifice. He thought of the quiet companionship in the train car, of the steady presence that had pulled him from his nightmares, of the soldier who had fought at his side. He understood now. His new mission was not to replace Phantom, but to honor him. It was to ensure that his sacrifice had meant something, that the legacy he died to protect would be nurtured, guarded, and prepared for a future that he would never see. He was healed, not because the scars of Afghanistan or the pain of his loss had vanished. They never would. He was healed because he had finally accepted them. He had taken the broken pieces of his past, his guilt, his skills, his grief, and forged them into a shield to protect the future. This was his father's legacy. This was Phantom's legacy. And now it was his. He stood up and looked out at the endless, pristine wilderness. With Spectre trotting faithfully at his heels, Jimmy Riley, the guardian, turned to face the long watch ahead. They say loyalty is a bond forged in fire, but often it is a quiet presence in our darkest moments. It is the friend who understands our scars without needing words, and whose sacrifice gives us a profound reason to heal and to live for something greater than ourselves. If this story of courage and companionship moved you, your support means the world to us. We invite you to share it with someone whose loyalty has been a light in your life, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. To hear more tales of the bonds that save us, we hope you will subscribe to our channel, and you can discover our newest story by clicking the video that has just appeared on your screen.